Greetings, Retreat Church. Good to bring the word of the Lord to you once again. Have you ever noticed that the main thing is not always the most obvious thing or the upfront thing that we're dealing with, either in life or in the scriptures? Sometimes we wish it was, right? Sometimes we wish the main thing was the most obvious thing, and that whatever we were truly dealing with was right there on the surface for us to easily recognize, to easily notice, but so oftentimes it is not. And when we're dealing with the book of Acts chapter 10, the most kind of shocking thing or startling thing or most obvious thing is not actually the main point and what God is trying to address with Peter and Cornelius, and then addressing all those that surrounded them in the early church and what God was doing in the early church as he ministered to and through Peter and Cornelius and their entire household in Acts chapter 10. Here in Acts chapter 10, we have a couple of things happen. We have this most obvious thing was with Peter, when God began to speak to Peter and change Peter's mind concerning the Gentiles and concerning how God was moving the church into the Gentile world and removing that barrier between Jew and Gentile. And what God used was a vision with a sheet, what appeared to be a sheet with all sorts of animals laid out on it, being lowered from heaven. And then the words to Peter, "Take and eat." And then Peter, denying that or rejecting that and saying, "Lord, I've never touched an unclean food. No unclean food has ever touched my lips." And Peter is pretty adamant about that. That's been his tradition. That's been his understanding about God. That's been his understanding about how he's supposed to live out his faith in God. And here comes this thing to where the issue is not food. It's simply not. And I know that a lot of times we go to this text in Acts chapter 10 and say, see, look, we don't have to deal with the dietary issues of the Old Testament. We're not bound by those. And we use Acts chapter 10 as a proof text that we can eat whatever we want. And that's not the point. Eating whatever you want is not the point of this text at all. Yet it is maybe the most obvious thing about the text is that Peter was told to eat things that before he was told that he was not to eat. But the main thing that God is doing is removing a barrier. And he's teaching Peter and he's teaching Cornelius that racial barrier was being removed. And he was teaching Peter something very important. And we see that Peter actually understood the message. He actually got it because he knew that as he moved forward in this, he knew that the issue was not food. Because though he received a vision of food being lowered on a sheet and he was told to take and eat, by the time he begins to speak to the Gentiles, he reveals that God has spoken to him in a deeper way. Notice in verse 34 of chapter 10, when Peter begins to speak to the people at Cornelius' house, he says this, "So Peter opened his mouth and said, 'Truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him.'" You hear that? That's what Peter took away from the vision. That's what Peter began to understand that God was doing as God showed him this unclean animals and told him to take and eat. And as he protested that and as he defended himself, he is revealing that nature within us, that when God starts to do something new, when God starts to remove barriers, so often we get defensive. We look at our own past. We look at the things that we have never done or always done, and we really start to look to ourselves. Isn't it interesting that at the beginning of that vision, Peter is not focused on what God is doing, but Peter is focused upon what he has never done, what he himself has never participated in. See, when God starts to move among a people, so often the people focus on themselves. And when we read the Bible and we hear that God is on the move and God is doing great things, we tend to personalize that. We tend to individualize that when that's not the point. We miss it entirely. But somehow through the Holy Spirit, Peter is beginning to understand that in this time, in this place in the book of Acts, God was removing a barrier. And boy, we could use God to remove some of those barriers that we are experiencing in our culture today, can't we? Especially this issue of racial divide. Boy, that we would learn. And Christians, I'm asking you to pray that each and every one of us would learn this lesson that Peter has learned, that God shows no partiality, that God does not favor one race above the next. And for some of you that have a struggle with Christianity, you may think that God favors and loves only specific people. Maybe you think that Christianity is something that was birthed in a Jewish nation and then adopted by an American nation or a Western nation, and that all other parts of the world outside of the West they're not really Christian. Maybe they're Muslim, maybe they're Hindu, maybe they're Buddhist, maybe all these different types of belief systems. And you think that, well, if you're born in America, perhaps you'll be a Christian, but if you were born in Iraq, then you're probably going to be a Muslim. That if you were born in India, you're probably going to be Hindu. I want you to notice that this Christianity in the very first century, God is saying, I'm not building my church based upon race. I'm not building my church based upon geographic borders or boundaries. Those are all things that God put in place way back in the book of Genesis when he created division among people at the Tower of Babel. That in the book of Acts, he's erasing all that. And notice, if you would go back and read in Genesis, when God did that, the Tower of Babel, when he separated nations and languages, he did so that there might be a confusion among the people so that they may seek him to find unity. But God has never shown partiality to people, never have loved one over the next. You may want to argue with me with that point and say, Paul, every bit of the Old Testament was God favoring the Jews and rejecting everyone else. Not so. If you were to read carefully, remember I said that the most obvious is not always the main point. Notice when you go back and read the book of Genesis and God's relationship with Abraham, that as he created that covenant with Abraham and how he told Abraham that he was going to turn him into a large family, into a great nation, it was for the purposes of blessing all nations. God's point all along throughout the entire scriptures was to bless every nation and every person in every culture without regard to geographic boundary, nationalistic origin, no matter of skin color. God was blessing all nations. God shows no partiality, and until his people get a hold of that issue and start living that out, then we'll remain divided. We'll remain in discord. But when we get a hold of that, the Church of Jesus Christ can be an example of what it means to live out the characteristic of God, that he shows no partiality. God bless you today. We love you. If you are in need, please visit us at theretreatchurch.com or visit one of our services. We'd love to pray with you. God bless you. We'll see you next time.